So welcome to this webinar focused on providing some practical tools for delivering development alongside tackling the environmental crisis, working hand in hand. The context for this event is the significant changes that have been recently announced, even more so than has been in recent years, for the planning policy and the planning reforms that are planned alongside the forthcoming Environment Act, which hopefully should give some clarity about how we can tackle the environmental crisis alongside that desire to deliver more development as needed for the green recovery, to build back better, etc. Mantras that you will have heard before. So today we're highlighting why green infrastructure is so critically important to a sustainable future, and introducing you to the Building with Nature tool, providing some case studies from across the industry to show how once competing ambitions of development and environmental quality can actually be effectively delivered together. So thank you for joining us. A little bit more housekeeping. So keep your camera off because we're being recorded if you want to. We've got a mixed audience today, and some of our polls will help to illuminate who we have with us and the level of understanding about this agenda. There's a Q&A section at the end of the webinar, so please use the Q&A function, and if you can, indicate who you'd like your question to be posed to. We'll get to as many as we can, but if we can't, we'll share answers as possible after the event in some of the follow-up information. And if you have technical difficulties, please use the Building with Nature email to let Daniel know, who can provide you with some support. We're on quite a tight schedule, so we'll be, and the speaker biographies were circulated ahead of time, so we'll keep introductions to the minimum and focus on the content of the webinar. So we'll get going now. I'll hand over to Rachel Cripps, who's going to run the first couple of polls for you.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a couple of polls that will be running throughout the webinar today. I'll just launch the first one now. So we've got 3 questions there. Just what industry do you represent? Have you heard of Building with Nature before today? And do you think that development could be part of the solution to the climate and ecological crisis? So we'll just give a minute for everyone to vote. We're almost there. Okay, just to keep us on track, I'll end us there. We've got most people have voted. So it seems we have a lot of people from local planning authorities. About half of people have heard of Building with Nature. That's great, and that's a really positive response to question number 3. Brilliant. Share those results for everyone to see. And I will hand back to Rachel.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Really positive response there, particularly around can development be part of the solution. I think that's why we're all here, isn't it? And the first presentation we're going to have is from Colm Bowe from Liverpool John Moores University, also the development director, development manager for Nature North, who's going to talk to us around how we can support decision making to ensure that green infrastructure helps deliver some of those outcomes. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Can everyone see my screen? Just to check. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, we can see that.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm Colm Bowe. I'm a senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores, but as also been pointed out, I'm development manager at Nature North. So Nature North is a a collaboration of environmental organisations that are trying to drive nature recovery for climate resilience and green growth across the north of England. The work I'm going to be talking to you about today actually largely comes out of the work I'm doing through Liverpool John Moores University, where I lead a small research team working on natural capital type projects, but it is actually very relevant to some of the thinking that we're also doing within Nature North. And just to acknowledge one of my colleagues, Dr. Sandra Angers-Blondon, who's not on the call today, but I'll be showing lots of fancy maps and images, and she's our kind of main technical person in my team, and she's actually responsible for those, so just to acknowledge that. So the benefits of green infrastructure and green space are fairly well understood, they're fairly well known, there's lots of evidence around them. And those benefits are really relevant to developers around a number of topics that are really key to developers. So around things like placemaking, climate change resilience, supporting net zero, bringing development and growth to an area, and also improving the health resilience of that area. And so we can look at those different benefits through those benefits that are kind of addressing climate resilience or providing nature-based solutions. So we know that green space, you know, plant trees or create new vegetation that will sequester carbon. We know that green infrastructure is very important in terms of flood regulation, particularly in an urban environment around SUDs, and particularly addressing things like surface flooding. And we also know that they're really important for improving air quality, taking up particulate matter, and nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide and other pollutants like that. Also very important in terms of climate resilience and cooling temperatures, particularly within our urban areas. But they're also really important for things like placemaking as well. So that can be particularly around creating a sense of social cohesion, creating improving a sense of place of the people who live there, and creating ownership around the people that live in a particular area. And there's also evidence around graduates choosing to live in places where there's more green infrastructure, and there's lots of evidence around property uplift, particularly when it's close to green space that has a function, so functional green spaces. Also really important for biodiversity, both for connecting patches of habitat that might be outside those developments or urban areas, but also providing home for urban ecology, also providing home for pollinators. And it's also really important for improving our mental health and our physical well-being. And that's really important around kind of green growth side of things as well, to improve that health resilience and the whole Build Back Better agenda, but also around that productivity gap that we see in certain areas where there's, the people are living in poor environments where they don't have equal access to that green space. We're getting better at measuring those benefits, and we can do that in a range of different ways. One of the ways we can do that is through economic values, and we're starting to understand better about how those benefits in green infrastructure both benefit both society, governments, and business. So, I won't go into too much detail around this. There's lots of literature around this. I've suggested one particular kind of policy brief that provides lots of information around the benefits that come from green infrastructure. But what's perhaps more important, is that we actually how we embed consideration of these benefits within decision making. And the Building with Nature standards are a very clear way of being able to do that. But at Liverpool John Moores, we've also been developing a spatial planning tool that can help to support embedding those benefits within decision making. So essentially what we've developed is a natural capital and ecosystem service mapping approach that takes nationally available data, combines that together to give you a detailed land use or habitat map. And then from that detailed habitat map, we can then derive these ecosystem service maps. We can also then combine it with other kind of socioeconomic data like multiple deprivation index and census data to also create demand, to identify areas where we can identify the demand for those environmental benefits as well. And we've been using that tool in a number of different ways, but one of the ways we've been using that is around making decisions around green infrastructure and understanding the effects of development on those environmental benefits on our natural capital and ecosystem services. So this is an example of how we've been using our tool to do that. So this is actually working with a developer or a landscape architect company called Eco Responsive Environments. And what they basically approached us, and they basically created this really progressive master plan, this really progressive design around the redevelopment of a site in Runcorn that they were using as an entry to a river hosted design award, which they're actually successful in winning. So what we're able to do is we're able to take our existing land use map, which had the site as it currently exists now, and we were able to take their master map, their master plan of how they envisage this development looking, and then we're able to burn that onto our habitat map, and then we were able to measure the environmental benefits pre-intervention and then post-intervention. And as you can see from the changes, the actual footprint of the site has actually increased. But as they've redeveloped the site, they've also planned for quite a lot of new green infrastructure, putting in sods, so quite a progressive development in this case. As I said, we were able to put that through our tool, and we were able to measure the change in environmental benefits, both between pre-intervention and if you were to build this development as they had set out. And actually what we found is largely you see an increase in those environmental benefits from doing that. And we're able to measure that both at the kind of red line boundary of the site itself, but also at larger geographical extents. So why is that important? Well, that's really key for potentially for developers in terms of when they're creating their master plans to think about how the green infrastructure might impact on the environmental benefits that are coming from their designs, and how they might think about the type and extent of green infrastructure that they might want to produce. It's also quite important for planners in local authorities, for example, to understand how the different developments that are planned across their area might be impacting on those environmental benefits, might be impacting on that natural capital and ecosystem services. We've also been using this approach to try and identify where you might want to create new green infrastructure. So essentially, again, we've been taking our land use map, and because we know, for example, where existing woodlands are, we can then use ecological network analysis to identify areas where we might want to enhance that ecological network to be able to increase connectivity through the landscape for various species. We can then also take our ecosystem service demand and capacity maps, and we can look at areas, for example, where there's particularly high demand, for example, for the various environmental benefits like air purification, or where currently there's actually a low level of those ecosystem services being provided. And then we can combine that with other data that might come out of the Environment Agency, like flood risk, or data coming out of local plans, to help kind of enhance that decision making about where you might want to create new green infrastructure. And then, of course, we can mask out areas where we might not want to create new green infrastructure, such as existing heritage sites, existing wildlife sites, peatlands, for example, if you're talking about woodlands. So again, why is that important to developers and planners? So it allows you to consider both the biodiversity and the multiple benefits together, because you're thinking about both that ecological network and the various ecosystem services. It's key around decision making in terms of insetting and offsetting. So a developer might want to know if they're creating a development in a certain place and they want to do a certain amount of insetting, is that going to enhance ecological networks? Is that going to potentially provide ecosystem services in those places where they're most needed? And if you can't manage that on site, then if you're going to achieve offsetting, how working with the planners, you'll be able to do that in a strategic way. So it allows developers to work alongside planners in a strategic way to kind of optimize the benefits of green infrastructure. And again,
sorry, Carl, to interrupt, just a couple of minutes left.
Brilliant. And of course, these approaches kind of align very nicely with those being, the standards being developed from Building with Nature around trying to think about those multiple benefits, around trying to think about achieving environmental net gain across developments. So the work we've been doing in Liverpool City region, we've actually been working to embed that within policy as well. So we've been working with the Liverpool City region Combined Authority and the spatial planning team there, and they're currently in the process of going through their consultation for their spatial development strategy. And what we've been doing is working with them to develop policies or draft kind of policy areas that can then be part of that consultation. So we've been looking at with them around their natural environment and green infrastructure policy area, looking at how we can put in kind of policy areas that try and embed the natural capital approach, try and embed this green infrastructure approach. Highlight that we want to achieve multiple benefits, and then using evidence bases like the ones I presented to you to prioritise and identify strategic opportunities for that green infrastructure, and also try and produce a consistent measure for measuring environmental net gain, and make sure all communities have equal access to green space. Yeah, so if you'd like kind of further information on the approach we're using, I've highlighted the website there, but I've also written a chapter recently with the British Ecological Society alongside Alistair Scott, who I know is involved in the Building with Nature programme as well. And we've tried to kind of talk about how some of these kind of spatial approaches can be used to inform decision making to optimise those benefits of green infrastructure. So thanks very much for listening, everyone.
Thanks very much. Yes, some really interesting information about how we can use evidence to underpin these principles in particular locations there, and the use of that. Without further ado, we'll move on to Gemma, who has really driven the creation of the Building with Nature tool. So she's going to give you that overview of what the tool is and what it can do. So Gemma, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And a hard act to follow there, Colin. Really enjoyed your presentation. I'm just going to get the slides ready for you. 2 seconds. And here we go. Okay, so I'm Dr. Gemma Jerome, just whilst I get these ready for you. And as Rachel said, I am the Director of Building with Nature and a founding member of the team who started this process of creating a national benchmark for green infrastructure back in 2015. So we're now 6 years into this process, and it's really exciting to be able to share with you where we've got to. So the first thing to understand about Building with Nature is that it's the UK's first benchmark for green infrastructure, and what underpins that benchmark is a set of quality standards. So that framework of evidence-based standards can be used by both planners and developers to help define what good looks like. They're free to use, and we're really excited that people are downloading them at great speed from our website, and we're working closely with a number of schemes to make sure that we are securing benefits for people and wildlife. So the key thing to understand about our standards and the accreditation system that works alongside them is that we're here to define quality. So we have other tools that are focused on the quantum of green infrastructure, some great metrics. We just saw the launch of the DEFRA metric 3.0 this week, but this is all about quality. So we've done that by drawing on academic evidence and good practice guidance, so good industry practice, looking at what does good look like when it comes to green infrastructure at each stage of the development process. So our standards can be applied at the very early stages of planning and feasibility of development through to an application for planning approval. So we follow that process through, and then the same standards can support those stakeholders involved in implementation, so construction professionals and those who are engaged in making sure the green infrastructure features are implemented and established in the right way, and then all the way through to long-term management, maintenance, monitoring, and where necessary remediation of those features to make sure we're actually delivering those benefits for people and wildlife. We can also use these standards in all types of development. So we're talking about residential-led development, mixed-use development, but also infrastructure development and community and public sector infrastructure as well. And we're also talking about every scale of development. So we've made these holistic design principles as flexible as possible for as many stakeholders to understand and use and get the benefit from. The standards framework is, as I said, available from our website. It's free to use, so anybody can download this standards framework and get going with understanding what the definition of high quality green infrastructure is. We're very pleased to say that given we started this project 6 years ago, we have now launched our second version of the standards, and that's because we are committed to make sure our standards reflects the current industry good practice, the current policy and legislation across the UK. And we also are very aware that this is a live area of research and development, that we now understand things we didn't understand about climate change and the impact that high quality green infrastructure can have on making livable places and also protecting wildlife, because the ecological emergency is twinned with the climate emergency. And then we've just lived through a health pandemic, so the health emergency is also at the heart of what we do at Building in Nature. And it's those elements that mean we were able to refresh the standards framework, and we launched that just a few weeks ago alongside our green infrastructure training product that is now supporting local authority planners and other key stakeholders in local authorities to make sure that we're actually bringing forward development which is going to protect us and also allow us to flourish now and into the future. So we're really excited to be able to share this new standards framework with you. The framework itself is 12 standards, and they're standards focusing on the quality of green infrastructure, and they taken together, we're talking here about the essential ingredients of high quality placemaking. So the way to think about Building in Nature is it's about people and wildlife. So it's really about placemaking and placekeeping. And we've done that by simplifying into these 4 themes. So these are the key areas of understanding at each stage of the planning and development process. We need to be thinking about standards that relate to multifunctional networks, management and maintenance, and all of those key areas of compliance with local policy and delivering environmental gains. That's all captured in the core. Then we've got the 3 W's: wellbeing, water and wildlife. And those 4 together ensure that we are, I'm just keeping an eye on time, we are delivering high quality places for people and wildlife. We're so lucky to have a fantastic set of green infrastructure experts on our standards board. So alongside the Building in Nature Management Board, which oversees our charitable objectives, we also have a standards board. And I won't read through the logos here, but you can see that we're really well supported by a fantastic set of both professional bodies and as well as government representatives from across the UK to really reassure you and build confidence in the industry and built environment sector that the Building in Nature standards really are the go-to framework for understanding what good looks like. The key message of this slide is we're doing it. So we launched our original standards in 2018, and we've been very busy since then working directly with industry. So we have over 50 schemes who are using these standards, and we're stretching across the UK. So from central Scotland to Cornwall, we've got physical development, delivering high quality green infrastructure. We've also got local authorities using these standards to help accredit policy. We have between 10 and 50 downloads of the standards per week, so that's very exciting, and that's a range of stakeholders using these. We have an assessor training course, so we work with a large network of built environment and natural environment professionals who then are on the ground interpreting the standards and essentially hand-holding whole design teams and project teams through the planning and development process to make sure these standards are being interpreted and actually building high quality development on the ground. And we also have, as I said, local authorities. We're working with local authorities through our GI training to make sure people are more effectively thinking in joined up ways, because green infrastructure is multidisciplinary, and that can be both its challenge and its absolute strength. So as an organisation, Building in Nature is here to support you to make better policy to then support the delivery of more sustainable development. And one way we do that is through the accreditation system. So as I said, you can be using the standards. They're free and open source, and we will continue to refresh and make those and keep those for everybody to use. But you can also pursue accreditation against those standards. And we offer a number of awards reflecting the different stages of a development. So for outline, those developments which have an outline stage, we have the design award, and that essentially is a way of saying, putting a line in the sand, saying this development is on track to delivering high quality green infrastructure. And then we have a full award, which is for those schemes that come straight through to full planning application, or if we're converting from an outline, the reserve matters applications. And that really is where we start to spotlight good development on the ground, because that includes a post-construction check. And from our early consultation, that was really, really key to include in a new tool for green infrastructure. As an accreditation system, we wanted to make sure that people are actually following through on those designs. And also it's a great incentivization to be able to fly that flag, say you have a Building in Nature award, and help your commercial drive as well. So the final stage is that you can apply for a national award as part of the Landscape Institute Awards, and that's where we really see those schemes that have been built out and are in use. And then we also have, in addition, a policy award, which is specifically for strategic policy documentation such as local plans, SPDs or GI strategies, and we've got some great examples on our case study section of the website where you can see the policy award being used in that way. Okay, so my final slide is just to give you a flavour of what industry is telling us are the benefits of Building in Nature for them. The key message is that having a shared framework of consistent evidence-based standards which act as design principles to guide the thinking and the decision making of the design team, and if possible using that at an early stage of planning, is really helping to reduce planning uncertainty. So instead of an arbitrary back and forth between planning officers and applicants about what's expected, and that being very time consuming and ultimately costly, we're talking here about having an agreement at a very early stage about what good looks like, what the parameters of design quality are in this particular case. And then that can help with a smoother and faster passage through planning. And that ultimately, that's my timer going, so I'll just finish off. That ultimately is benefiting both the developer and the planner. So that's what we're being told these standards can really help with. It can also help with making sure that we're actually allocating the most sustainable sites for development and working with ecological assets as opportunities rather than constraints. So these standards can help deliver development in contested landscapes, and we have examples where that's being used. So rather than seeing ecological assets on site or water on site as a problem for your design team, actually that can be your biggest asset, and building a scheme around that. And we can talk with you about how that's playing out in a number of schemes. And ultimately, we're here to offer a tool which makes all of your other responsibilities easier. This isn't an extra thing to do. This is about cohering your existing responsibilities around biodiversity gains, around health and wellbeing outcomes, natural water management, and making a connected landscape to really contribute to that nature recovery network. These standards cover all of those areas in a one-stop shop way. So ultimately, we know this can actually benefit your development and your policy making. And that's all I wanted to say today. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Gemma. Really comprehensive overview of what the standard is and what it has done. And I would like to just reflect that it's matured a lot. So I was fortunate to be hearing about Building with Nature when it was a younger initiative, and it's matured a lot and it's really solid now. So I think people could have confidence in it. So over to Rachel now for another poll, I think.
Yes, thank you. I will just launch our second poll. So we've just got one question in this one. What are the barriers for you to integrating green infrastructure into development design or local policy? And this is a multiple choice, so you can select all that apply for this one. like not mandatory is a very popular option. About over half responses, just give it a few more seconds. Okay, slowed down, so I will end the polling there. So not mandatory was the most popular response then, but also cost and time were very popular. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And very revealing that around how we like to have certainty when we're going to be confident to implement things. However, when you choose to implement things, great things can happen. And our next presentation is an illustration of that. So I'm going to hand over to both Sheena, Kevin and Aileen, who are the team who've worked together to deliver the Forth Valley Hospital and Larbert Woods in Stirling up in Scotland, and a great story for them to tell. So over to you guys.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen with everybody. So hopefully you can see my screen now. I'm Sheena Rayburn and I'm a landscape architect and a director with Rayburn Farquhar Bowen. We've been involved in this development for a number of years, and I'll just give you some context to it, and then I'll pass over to Aileen and Kevin. Just to give you some context, the hospital was built in 2011 and it was to replace local hospitals in Falkirk and Stirling, and at the time it was the largest hospital in Scotland. So it's in the central belt area of Scotland, west of Edinburgh and east of Glasgow, and the site itself actually was a historic estate around Larbert House, built in the 18th century, and there was a formal drive, there was policy woodlands, there was a grand loch in front of the house with parkland trees, an ice house, stone walls, stables and walled gardens, so it was a typical sort of historic estate. And in the 1920s, the site actually became, the house was still there, but the site was developed for the Royal Scottish National Hospital. And that was one of the first and largest hospitals in Scotland to care for children with learning disabilities. And it provided an attractive setting, but also they really saw the benefits and the therapeutic qualities of exposure to fresh air, nature and daylight, and really used the grounds to its full. That hospital closed in 1991, and the site actually was really neglected for over 20 years. So you can see some of the photographs here that the house fell into disrepair and there was an extensive fire. There was an invasion of rhododendrons surrounding the loch to the extent that local dog walkers didn't know there was a loch there. It was so screened, and the woodlands were really unmanaged, and there was some over mature parkland trees. So when we became involved as landscape designers for the hospital site, you know, this was, I suppose it's worth saying that we really saw this as a design that promotes good health rather than just treating illness. And so the hospital site itself, the full site, is over 130 hectares. And over half of that, 70 hectares of that, was the sort of remaining historic landscape. And the rest of the site was developed. And there was a number of courtyards and visitor gardens. And as part of some of the planning obligations, the remainder of the site had to be brought back into positive management. Now, that seemed to be a relatively simple thing to do, and these are some of the courtyard spaces, so that people looked onto green space. But there was a partnership formed between the NHS Forth Valley and Forest and Land Scotland, along with Falkirk Council and Central Scotland Forest Trust, and we were asked to secure, we prepared a landscape master plan and a framework and design guidance for the remainder of the site that wasn't developed for the hospital. So we assessed key assets of the estate. We set out principles for restoration of historic elements, such as the ha-ha and various walls and we set out future management and routes for public access and restoration of potentially the built elements within this designed landscape, and set out some design guidance. So there was a number of new paths through the woodlands. There was a restocking of parkland trees and conversion to native woodland, and there was some residential development within the former stables and walled garden. So these are some of the paths through the woodland areas. There was a lot of over mature trees that were felled and restocked with new planting. The rhododendron was cleared around the loch, and the sluice was repaired and so on, so that access to that was given again. And some of the access and wayfinding improvements here are just shown in terms of reference to the historic estate. Finding your way around when you're in hospital to get to the woodlands was really important. So there's signage both within the hospital, but also how to get to the woodland areas quickly, because we're aware that staff and visitors, you know, may be pressed for time. And there was a competition to design a viewing point on the old boat shed that looks straight out over towards Larbert Church. And also, the Larbert House was converted into apartments and some development in the stable block and walled garden. I'm just going to hand over to Aileen now, and she can give you some of the benefits that have come from the development.
Okay, thank you, Sheena. I'd like to start by saying we're really keen at NHS Forth Valley for our patient, staff, visitor and wider local communities to see the hospital grounds as places of good health and wellbeing, and not just places to come to when we're experiencing poor health. We want it to be places to come to promote and support our health, a place where we can use to become fitter as well. So really changing the way we look at hospitals and care and treatment. We actively support and encourage our patients and staff to use physical activity as a tool for improved physical health and mental health and well-being as part of pre-treatment and care and rehabilitation, because fit and active patients have better health outcomes. They have shorter lengths of stay and are faster to recover, and our grounds are absolutely key to this. We also support our staff to embrace walking meetings where possible. Here's the slide here. So for example, within a minute of walking out the front door at Forth Valley Royal Hospital, you are in beautiful green space, which is a very calming effect. And as Sheena said, we've also got a stunning loch. Many people of all ages walk, jog, fish, cycle, exercise, and indeed sing as part of a choir around the loch and woods area around the grounds. You can see here we've got local groups such as the Boys Brigade, Second Larbert. They hold cross-country competitions in the grounds. Local schools come and use the outdoor classroom to learn, and our key partners, Forest and Land Scotland, use the grounds for outdoor activity. Just now we have a patient group that meets every Thursday in the woods and grounds for 3 hours trying different activities. So the picture on the bottom right there, that's the outdoor classroom, which is a superb facility, as indeed is the whole grounds structure. Lots of walking, lots of outdoor initiatives going on, yes, and at times we do have the Tai Chi still. So just like yeah, so when we think about the British and Scottish governments, they actively encouraged us all to get out every day for physical activity since the first lockdown last year, and that's due to the very powerful impact that physical activity has on our mental health and well-being. The loch and wood area at Forth Valley Royal Hospital were extremely popular and well used by people of all ages, especially at this time, and I'm glad to see this continues. We installed strength and balance signboards around the loch as well to encourage everyone to spend a minute or two doing some strength and balance exercises, and I have to say your 80-year-old self will thank you for starting these now. Next slide, please, Sheena. Just to finish off, we're also we work incredibly hard around the active travel agenda, where we really do encourage our staff and patients to actively travel to work or to come to their hospital appointments, either walking or cycling. Scooting's maybe a wee bit ambitious and for the future. We work in partnership with Forth Environment Link, who have active travel hubs, and Edinburgh University as well. And some of our key results are, for example, there have been more applications to our cycle scheme in the previous year than there has been in the past 3 years combined. 117 staff have had free long-term loans of e-bikes, and the strong feedback from them was around how this improved their mental health and well-being and physical fitness. We have serviced 512 bikes for free for staff, for patients and the local community. And we also, as you can see here on the slide, we have a bike medic service, which is quite innovative. And it's really like an AA service for cyclists, and it offers a degree of safety and comfort for our staff to cycle, but they might not have the technical knowledge if something goes wrong. So the bike medic will come out free of charge and either do a repair at the roadside or take them to where they need to go. When the hospital first opened, there was a return on investment study which was done, and it was reported that for every £1 investment, £4.50 was generated. We have just done a piece of work related to our partnership approach to cycling, and for every £1 that NHS Forth Valley invested, this resulted in £8.50 being generated. This was put straight back into staff health, patient health and well-being. I would say it's simply the right thing to do financially, socially and for health benefit to invest in high quality green infrastructure as part of any new development going forward. I'd now like to hand over to you to Kevin Lafferty from Forest and Land Scotland, who's going to speak to you about innovation and influence.
Okay, thank you, Aileen. Really just coming back down to the practicalities of innovation and influence. This project showcased collaboration between the environment and the health sector and local authorities. And one of the important things to share with you is the fact that it was the UK's first site for a jointly funded health ranger. So this was a ranger whose job was to work with clinicians and staff and patients to take recovery and treatment programmes outside and to use contact with nature for rehabilitation and recovery. And that was jointly funded by the NHS and at the time by Forestry Commission Scotland. The project has been a flagship, and it's influenced a national programme across Scotland, and that programme is called the NHS Green Space Demonstration Programme. And the project has really focused on improving the quality and the accessibility of the green space. So least restrictive access and providing access around the loch for people who have mobility restrictions or wheelchair users was one of the key aspects. And, you know, as we've already seen, it's increased significantly the number of staff, patients and visitors who are using the space. Now, in terms of the partnership and collaboration, another first is the fact that Forestry and Land Scotland now manage the outdoor estate on behalf of the NHS under a 10-year MOTO arrangement. So this is showing that land management and how we manage public assets and land can really be done in partnership. And we need to use these spaces and view them as assets and not really as a burden. And I think that's really exciting. So the partnership is to build links between the health and the environment sectors. And this is following growing evidence that public health can be improved by getting people engaged with the natural environment. We know that urban environments are growing, and the quality of the urban environment is key and will really be central to public health in the long term.
Kevin, sorry to interrupt, just a couple of minutes left.
Sure, yeah, and a couple of key points just to say. I mean, key to longer term success will be a whole system approach. And I think building with nature, which better links environment, health, voluntary and other sectors is key. So we benefited because by working in collaboration, we were able to bring more to the table. So what I really encourage everyone to do is to think about how you can work with partners you maybe haven't worked with before, and that they can add value basically and help contribute. And finishing off, the Director of Facilities and Estates who helped build this hospital, the hospital cost 300 million, the environmental improvements cost $500,000. He's had a 30-year career in NHS. He said that was the best £500,000 worth of spend he ever made in his career, and it's added the most value in terms of health and wellbeing outcomes. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you all. Really inspiring. And I think that last point you make, Gary, sums it up, doesn't it? That sometimes it's not a huge investment. It's just some investment that can make the difference from taking something from being an average scheme into a really beneficial one. So fantastic example there. Thank you. So next we have Carol and Gary. Sorry, I just called Kevin Gary. I've just realised. So apologies, Kevin. Yeah. So next up, we've got Carol and Gary, who are going to talk to us around another case study.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you see the screen? Okay.
Yes, we can. In case you can't see us nodding.
Yeah. Great stuff. Well, firstly, thanks to Sheena for using the term "haha." I haven't heard that for a while. One of my favourite in landscape. But I'm Gary Watt from Igloo Regeneration. I'm joined by
Carol Somper from So Sustainable. I'm the Building with Nature Assessor.
Today together we're going to talk you through housing development in Sunderland called Vox Living, which we're delivering on behalf of Sunderland City Council. So let's see. There we go. I thought we'd do that by explaining Igloo's approach to development through footprint. We then give you some context of Riverside Sunderland at master plan level. We'll then drop in to give you a little bit of a closer look at some of the housing development elements, and then we'll finish just with reflecting on why we've been using building with nature and how the process has worked for us. So to start, footprint is Igloo's own internal process for guiding project delivery. We do that by considering 6 elements, 6 dimensions, which we try and embed ambitions for each of them at the start of each project. And you'll see over towards the right, nature is one of those dimensions where we're aiming to create green and blue, ecologically diverse neighbourhoods in our projects. So that's the theory. This is how we apply it in practice. So this is Riverside Sunderland. It's land that straddles the River Wear. Sunderland City has ambitions to make this a new Riverside quarter for the city. They're aiming to deliver 1,000 homes here, along with around about 1 million square feet of workspace. We're going to focus today on the rather crudely drawn orange area to the bottom right, which is the former Vox Brewery. So whilst it looks a little bit green this now, it's really a brownfield development site, which we're looking to bring forward for 132 homes. We started that process back in October 2019 by holding something we call a co-creation workshop, which was with all the different stakeholders, local stakeholders and different departments of the council to create a joint vision for the project. And you'll see, particularly in green, some of those statements there reflect the 6 dimensions from the Igloo footprint process. You can see we're looking to reveal the existing ecology, looking to create a neighbourhood that embraces and integrates the waterside, an existing kind of forgotten park and connects it to the city. And also in blue, of course, things cross over. I'm looking to deliver climate and carbon positive development if we can. We took that vision for Sunderland, and these images are obviously pre-pandemic when we could actually meet people, but we road tested it with the community through 2 events. In the top right, we took over a shop in the local shopping centre to do an ideas workshop, and then we held a 4-day charrette process to gather people's thoughts. And you can see landscape was one of the themes we focused on and asked people what their thoughts were on that. And you can see the type of feedback we got, which was very positive, really, and placed landscape at the forefront of the project. People wanted wildlife and biodiversity, play opportunities in the space, scope for putting on events in the landscape, and overall this kind of general sense that sustainability and the environment will really help attract people back to live here, because that's what isn't happening now. There isn't a resident population really. So this was the outcome, which is a kind of high-level master plan, which sets in place some of the principles for development. There's really 4 new residential neighbourhoods there surrounding the river, and you can hopefully see a kind of green space in there, which is a presently unloved green space. Some of the people in the consultation didn't know it existed, who'd been in Sunderland for about.
Hello, I'm losing the sound.
Gary, I think we've lost your sound. I don't know if if your connection's just dropped out, but it might be worth just dipping back a minute.
Yeah, can you hear me again?
I can hear you now, yeah. Gary, we've lost your sound again. I think if it's okay, if you're able to, maybe we could move the slides on to Carol's section and come back to this. Would that be okay?
Well,
yeah,
we're doing a double act.
Oh, hang on. I think Gary's back now.
Yeah, sorry. I think it's just flashed up unstable. You okay? Did you hear me again?
Yes.
So, Carol, I think we were just going to, you were going to reflect on this slide.
Yeah, just wanted to make the point that the master plan approach has been really thorough and holistic, and those 3 main objectives in green have come out very strongly around regenerating and restoring what's been a very unloved part of the city, and make it a catalyst for city centre renewal, which is really interesting when you look at the extensive green infrastructure network that's been really strongly enhanced. So this is a very exciting new inner urban city area. So looking back at the industrial past of that part of Sunderland, you can see it was very, very intensively industrialised, and it's much greener these days, but it's still pretty unloved. So in looking at the building with nature approach to the Vox site in particular, it was important for me as an assessor to look back at the master plan, how needs were defined, the objectives set, and understand the full context for how the Vox living sits into that master plan. And it's very important that as an assessor you work closely with the project team, and I noticed in the poll that came back, one of the there was quite a few responses saying that building with nature is too time consuming. No, it's not, because it's just flexing into the planning process that you'd be using anyway, and it's very important that I help the project team members to achieve compliance against the standards in their documents, so it doesn't slow anything down. And we've got a 2-stage approach. So Gary's team, first of all, provided their draft documentation at a fairly advanced stage, which I then reviewed and could feed back where they perhaps missed something or something needed to be amplified, develop a provisional score sheet, and then everybody knows where they stand when it comes to submitting the planning application. Gary.
Okay, hopefully I'm back, but this is the Vox living element. In terms of the urban design, we've principally got 5 residential clusters here, which support movement through the site. They also create very quiet residential spaces in terms of communal gardens and muse spaces, which are car-free, which is a massive driver. The cars have been catered for off-site. And you can also see in red a new public square here, which was responding to that community desire for new event spaces. So it's a place for community gathering and also to enjoy the views over the river.
So you can see, whilst it's very dense new urban development in terms of the built structure, the the whole development's got an open edge linking with adjacent green spaces, and it's got very strong routes through and across, so it really provides easy access.
This again shows those key residential spaces, but the one I just wanted to pick out here was to the left and shown in green, which is Kingsley Gardens. It's key to the project. It's redevelopment of a kind of forgotten grassed area, and we're going to create a community garden there. That will link the Vaux housing, which sits on a slightly elevated plateau. You drop down through Kingsley Gardens and into what is the kind of new re-energised Riverside Park. But the gardens as well will be open to other residential communities rather than just Vaux. So it's helping to connect those communities to the existing city centre. So looking at the Core 1 standard for a multifunctional network, this really ticks all the boxes. It's very open and inclusive for all demographics, very multifunctional in terms of use and purpose, the way that there's an enhanced approach to existing green space and the creation of new green assets. And this just gives you a little flavour for the Kingsley Garden space. This shows the raised beds, raised principally because the site sits in an old cholera cemetery. It should result in significant volume of food production, given the scale of it. You can see some of the fruit trees there. There's also biodiverse grassland introduced here, and some native species in terms of the hedgerows that form the space. Next space I'm just going to highlight is Lambton View. To the right of this, you might pick up where the people are sitting is a little viewpoint back down the River Wear. At the centre, there's a piece of person I really love. It's almost this little mini forest, which is a real gateway into the scheme. So it's kind of signifying how important landscape is at that key entrance point. But that landscape also provides a function in terms of providing shelter from the north winds. As you'll see, there's a little cafe space to be introduced at the ground floor. So we're hoping that's a real gathering place for the community. But we wanted to use the landscape to provide just a little bit more of a appropriate microclimate for them. So in creating a really, really friendly user space for all types of users, the selection of the tree species, the configuration of the design, the way that water's being enabled to be taken away off surfaces through roadside swales, the grassland areas, the whole thing in creating that microclimate that Gary talked about is really climate resilient, not just at the point of post-construction completion, but as it matures into the future. And because the emphasis is on active travel, walking, public transport, cycling, it's creating a really clean airspace in the middle of the city centre. This just gives you a feel for one of the communal garden areas. So you can see the raised beds where residents will be able to grow veg and herbs, some playable spaces in there, just some low-level seating. And the key for us really is on the right, you can see how those homes integrate with the space. So they're going to be really open to that space, so the residents will be able to spill out their home into that shared garden, which was a really key part of our design philosophy on this project as an alternative to suburban type development. Carol,
just a couple of minutes left, Gary.
No problem.
Just very quickly, because it was primarily an industrial area with some green spaces that are sort of been left unmanaged, creating a new fairly dense development would mean careful attention to SUDs. So everywhere possible, permeable hard surfacing is being used to make sure that the water can get away. It all gets channeled into the existing Galley's Gill, and that's been made much more of a feature. So it's got real amenity value as well as performing a very important function, again, in a city centre.
I'm going to pass over that and just finish up then. In terms of why, from a development side, we use Building with Nature, there's not much point in Igloo saying we do good projects. We know we just need external accreditation now. So Building with Nature forms part of that suite. We use Home Quality Mark. We use RICS whole life carbon to measure the carbon performance, try and drive a reduction. And we're now using Building with Nature in terms of the green infrastructure. That's important for our funders, investors. Everyone's more interested in environmental sustainability and governance now. Planning and stakeholders, as has been mentioned before, it's good to be able to demonstrate to those partners that we have got a scheme that delivers. And finally, and probably most importantly, it's about attracting residents and buyers and tenants to these schemes, and we're actually able to demonstrate we've thought about the climate and thought about the landscape, thought about biodiversity, and here's someone externally validated that. Carol?
And it's been a real pleasure to be the assessor on this scheme, because the team's really collaborative. They really listen to each other and exchange ideas and views, and it was really a case of dotting I's and crossing T's and just helping to amplify where, particularly around climate resilience, a really good approach had been taken, but it hadn't been explicitly explained in the documentation. So I was able to help make sure that that came out very strongly to meet the requirements of Building with Nature.
And that's us. Apologies for the tech.
That's one of those things.
Yeah, that no problem. I think it's happened to the best of us in the last year and a bit, hasn't it, around the tech. Normally works brilliantly and just occasionally it catches us out. Thank you very much for sharing that wonderful scheme that has got so many positive features for the future in it. Really wonderful to see and exciting to visit in due course. We're pretty much running a little bit over, but not too bad in terms of time. So we'll move on to our next presentation, which is from Sarah, Rachel and Laura, who will be talking about how does the standard deliver on biodiversity net gain, that term that should become mandatory when the Environment Bill goes through. So over to you guys.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll just share my screen. There, can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm Rachel Cripps, one of the approved assessors at Lancashire Wildlife Trust, and together with Laura Hobbs from Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and Sarah Hawes from Eco North, the consultancy linked to Northumberland Wildlife Trust, we're just going to talk to you today a little bit about biodiversity net gain. So what we're going to cover, I'm going to just talk a little bit about what biodiversity net gain actually is, where it's come from, and then Laura's going to talk to you about what the fundamental principles are and how we deliver it. Sarah will then just go over how Building with Nature can help implement biodiversity net gain, and we will just summarise with a few take-home messages at the end. So what is biodiversity net gain? Well, it is an approach to development that seeks to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than it was before the development occurred. It aims to deliver improvements through habitat creation or enhancement after firstly avoiding and then mitigating harm. That's quite a lengthy definition, but very simply put, development that leaves biodiversity in a better state than before. So our policy of no net loss has not been working, and we really need to do something different if we are to make any progress towards reaching biodiversity targets. Biodiversity is essential to sustain our society and our economy, yet we are in an ecological and climate crisis, with many local authorities now declaring these emergencies. The State of Nature report is a very sobering read, with 41% of UK species having decreased in abundance since 1970. And 15% of species now threatened with extinction, and there's just been no let up in the net loss of nature in the UK. So it's hoped that through biodiversity net gain, the current loss of biodiversity through development will be halted and ecological networks can be restored, and that all supports the UK commitments to restore 30% of land for nature by 2030, and also the development of the local nature recovery strategies. So where did biodiversity net gain come from? Well, it's not a new concept. Pilot schemes have been running since 2012, and Warwickshire have actually had their own metric, which has been trialled over a number of years. And it does follow on from the government's aim in its 25-year environment plan to leave the environment in a better state than we found it. Biodiversity Net Gain is part of the National Planning Policy Framework, which states that development should deliver measurable gains for biodiversity, and it's supported by the Planning Practice Guidance, which references the use of a metric as the most pragmatic way of assessing this. So the Environment Bill actually sets out the mechanism by which biodiversity net gain from development is to operate. And the bill is expected to receive royal assent later this year. We have had quite a few delays, obviously, but planning authorities from this time will have a duty to implement the requirement to deliver biodiversity net gain on all developments covered by the Town and Country Planning Act. An increasing number of local authorities are already including biodiversity net gain, including Dorset and Warwickshire, so it is already mandatory in some areas. It is anticipated that the Environment Bill will introduce a minimum 10% net gain requirement, but some local authorities are asking for more. So, for example, Lichfield District Council guidance stipulates a 20% net gain in biodiversity for development proposals that pose a risk to key ecological features. And obviously, as Wildlife Trust, we will also be aiming for a minimum 20% net gain. I'll hand over to Laura.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. So if we're going to take anything home from this, I'd want everyone to remember that the most fundamental principle to take away is that biodiversity net gain is additional to traditional ecological assessments. So this means that it's additional to the mitigation hierarchy, which is the principle to first avoid, then minimise all harm to features of biodiversity interest, only then compensating for whatever that impact might be. So these features might include designated sites, protected species, and others such as irreplaceable habitats, which includes ancient woodlands. So if developments can't achieve this, then planning permission should be refused under the usual policy process that we're all familiar with. So what this means is that biodiversity net gain does not undermine or override any existing legislation or policy with regards to biodiversity. And only once full mitigation and compensation for features are fully incorporated into the scheme, can we then start to consider how we can actually enhance biodiversity in the local area. So biodiversity net gain assessments utilises habitats as a proxy for biodiversity. So this means that the usual ecological enhancement proposals, such as the integration of bat and bird boxes, are not considered to contribute to biodiversity net gains. Rather, these are the species compensation that should be implemented under the mitigation hierarchy. So utilising these principles, such as those outlined within Build with Nature, can really help to address this balance between the application of the mitigation hierarchy and to then start to implement biodiversity net gains on the site. So in order to try to prevent unforeseen delays and costs, it is advisable to consider designing biodiversity net gains into the scheme as early as possible. So for instance, utilising biodiversity net gains principles as a site selection tool would be really beneficial to avoid complications and costs further down the line by choosing sites of low biodiversity value for development. So this is something that is being implemented already by some local authorities, such as Sheffield City Council, who are asking for baseline biodiversity assessments to aid the site allocation process in the emerging local plan. We'll go next slide, please, Rachel. Yeah, thanks. So net gain assessment should be kept up to date and revised as the scheme progresses to ensure that there's smooth transition through the planning process. There is an emerging British standard on biodiversity net gains, if you're not familiar already, which is BS 8683, and that's really helpful in outlining all of this design process in detail. So if anyone wants any additional reading later on, it's worth a look. So as Rachel mentioned previously, biodiversity net gain principles are outlined within the NPPF, and that states that measurable gains must be demonstrated. This is built upon in the planning practice guidance, which state that a metric is the most pragmatic way to demonstrate that net gains for biodiversity have been achieved. So for this purpose, a metric has been developed by DEFRA for use nationwide, and it was, as Gemma mentioned earlier, released earlier this week as version 3.0. So whilst we've got this metric, which is an absolutely brilliant tool, we should bear in mind that there are some constraints in the application of that tool. And because of that, it's always recommended that it's applied by a professional ecologist. So for instance, a metric cannot take into account protected species, irreplaceable habitats, or features of local interest which may be highlighted in local policy. So whilst a metric helps us to inform decisions, it can't be forgotten that it is still just a tool, and a positive number does not necessarily equate to no biodiversity issues. So as such, decisions and management interventions need to take account of this expert ecological advice and not just the biodiversity unit's outputs of the metric. So one of the final principles to remember about biodiversity net gain is that it should include long-term management and monitoring proposals for the site and any off-site areas used for offsetting impacts. So long-term is generally considered to be about 30 years over the lifetime of the scheme, and it is being requested more and more by local authorities, and we are expecting that to be legislated under the Environment Bill. Next slide, please. So getting into the meat of how we actually deliver this. So the DEFRA metric 3.0 is expected to become the standard for use for all developments. So in its basic form, the metric is an Excel spreadsheet, which works by inputting the baseline units of the site. So that is the habitat classification and its condition. And there's a series of other multipliers as well, which will be informed by survey and sound assessment from professional ecologists. Gives a value for the number of units that will be lost or gained by the development. So guidance surrounding biodiversity net gain states that units should be delivered on site wherever possible, with off-site considerations only explored as a last resort. So within traditional development design, this can be extremely hard to achieve. However, by selecting sites for developments with low biodiversity values to start with and using the principles and standards for nature, can not be delivered on site, to make payment to a habitat bank or the local authority to deliver the required uplift in units. However, with these costs ranging from initial estimates from £9,000 to over £93,000 per unit, depending on what local area you're in, most of them averaging around £25,000 per unit, it's often much cheaper to deliver these on site wherever possible. So I'm going to pass over to Sarah, who will be able to take you through a bit of an example of how to actually implement this.
Thank you. As mentioned, the biodiversity metric is not only a tool to calculate the biodiversity value of a site post-development, but can also be used to identify the most cost-effective opportunities. By applying the metric early on at the stage where a site is being considered, the ecological constraints and opportunities can be assessed, not only providing a baseline biodiversity value, but also identifying the likelihood that 10% biodiversity net gain is going to be achievable on site. Beyond biodiversity net gain, by engaging ecologists early on, the requirement for further surveys can be identified, providing a realistic timeframe for delivery as many wildlife surveys have time constraints. A 10% increase in biodiversity can be achievable more easily, faster, and at lower cost on sites with habitat of low biodiversity value. Areas comprising amenity grassland and hard standing, for example, will have lower biodiversity value, and therefore only a small area of enhanced habitat on site will be required in order to deliver a sufficient uplift. There's also the added benefit that areas within suitable habitat for wildlife will not require further surveys, providing fewer delays and less constraints. By choosing these sites, there's also a real opportunity to enhance and improve the land for both people and wildlife. Next slide, please. So, for example, in order to develop 1 hectare of limestone grassland, the biodiversity value of which is 22 biodiversity units, then the value on site post-development will need to be 24.2 units. A development which proposes any hard standing or buildings will be unable to achieve the necessary 10% increase in biodiversity units on site, and therefore require the purchasing and enhancement of nearby land. Whereas 1 hectare of amenity grassland, such as a playing field, has a value of 2 units, requiring an increase on site of only 2.2. This can be created on site by enhancing the grassland to biodiverse rich neutral grassland, or including a variety of native shrubs alongside development. In terms of biodiversity, 1 hectare of limestone grassland is the equivalent of 11 hectares of amenity grassland. Therefore, choosing habitat of low value and poor condition will be most cost effective. On sites with a variety of habitats or ecological features, ecologists can assist in the design process by identifying habitats of high value that can be retained and enhanced, while focusing construction on habitats of lower value, providing a more cost-effective development again. Next slide, please. How building with nature can help. Building with nature not only encompasses the requirements of Biodiversity Net Gain, but also builds on legislation surrounding the environment and well-being. With a body of research surrounding well-being and the economic benefits continuing to grow, the potential for the landscape to contribute to local well-being is being realised, and the demand for developments which deliver this standard is rising. Building with nature builds on the current legislation to create sustainable and healthy communities. As Gemma mentioned earlier, the accreditation assurances during the planning application process that the development is of a high standard and will benefit the local community, thereby having the potential to smooth the planning process, saving time and further costs. I'll hand it back over.
Thanks, Sarah. So earlier on we spoke about how Biodiversity Net Gain and building with nature can be key to tackling the climate and ecological crisis. And the RTPI have written guidance on the tools that are most appropriate for use given declared climate emergencies. They have assessed each tool against 5 criteria: adaptation, mitigation, climate justice, plan making and development management. And building with nature is actually the only tool that successfully fulfills all of these criteria. So just to summarise, building with Biodiversity Net Gain can be a valuable site selection tool, helping to select the right site for the right development. We need to be thinking about how to meet biodiversity net requirements on your site now, as the earlier biodiversity net gain is considered, the easier it is to achieve. Resources required should be built into project costs, and biodiversity net gain does not replace any other ecological work such as protected species surveys. And building with nature can provide a framework to achieve biodiversity net gain on site, reducing potential costs. And it's also just worth noting that biodiversity net gain and building with nature are not a one-size-fits-all approach. Building with nature needs to be developed with the characteristics of the site in mind, and thus creating the best place possible for people and wildlife within the site constraints. Thank you.
Thank you, team from the Wildlife Trusts who have been working with the Building with Nature team on understanding the tool and learning to apply it in different contexts. Some really interesting insights there around the complexity, I suppose, of what many of the audience will be working in all the time, about how do you apply this stuff into real world developments and the challenges around that. So there's an opportunity for another poll now. So Rachel, do you want to run that one quickly, and then we'll get into Q&A. So a reminder to put any Q&A questions into the Q&A function if you can.
Yep, so here is the final poll, just 2 questions. So after hearing about building with nature, do you think you might want to use the standards to integrate green infrastructure into your work? And after hearing today's talk, do you now think development could be part of the solution to the climate and ecological crisis? So 2 quick questions there. Give it a few more seconds. We've just got over half people responded. Okay, we'll end it there. Seems to have slowed down. So just share the results with you. So that's excellent, overwhelming. 70% of people would consider building with nature, and really positive for the second question as well. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Rachel. That's interesting, and glad to see that people are curious and viewing the standard, what we've been sharing, positively. You were also going to share, I think, the next steps for people if they are interested, weren't you? So do you want to just do that?
Yes, Daniel's just going to pop a link to a form in the chat. So if anyone is interested and would like to speak to either myself or Laura or Sarah, on a one-to-one basis to discuss any schemes. If you just fill out the form and we can get back to you and arrange that. And of course, the session is being recorded as well, so we'll circulate that if anybody has missed anything.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Yeah, just to emphasise, someone's just asked actually in the chat, is the session being recorded? And I think it's going to be available on YouTube afterwards. So yeah, for both people who may want to listen back or to share with other colleagues. So I think great to see, and we've got a few questions now. Initially, Gemma, I think most of them are probably for you. So there's a couple of questions here. One around, is it an all or nothing approach, or is there a way to move yourself towards getting a building with nature standard if you're a developer? There's another question around, is building with nature and building for a healthy life, which is the Homes England toolkit, connected? So do you just want to start with those, and then we'll move on to some of the others?
Mute myself. Yeah, of course. Thank you, Rachel. Thanks for those questions. I did answer, but I will definitely represent what I said for everybody else's benefit. So in terms of moving projects through in a kind of sequential way and having different marks, we've actually just removed the marks from Building with Nature. So we did have good and excellent levels, but we actually decided that it was a much more comprehensive, simple, easy to understand and use system if we just have a Building with Nature award, and instead we focus on the different stages of a development and construction process, so design through to full with post-construction check and then national award. So to get a Building with Nature award is already a really fantastic achievement. It represents above policy compliance. So that's a lot of congratulations to get that. So yeah, that's my answer to Gordon's question. Nikki's question about the relationship between Building with Nature and other tools, accreditation systems, we gave a lot of thought to this. So we were very lucky to have some government funding and some funding from the Natural Environment Research Council in the early days of Building with Nature development and piloting. And in that process, we worked with the University West of England to review and evaluate what was missing from all of those other tools. So we do have published papers on this. If people want to get geeky around it, you can have a look at our journal papers. But essentially, I can just reassure you here now in person that what Building with Nature does is complete those other gaps in the Building for a Healthy Life, in BREEAM, in CEQL, and so it works in a complementary and supplementary way to those other tools. So specifically around Building for a Healthy Life, we have much more focus on green infrastructure and the spaces the spaces around the buildings, rather than the buildings and the grey infrastructure. But we are working with Homes England, and we've got examples of Homes England schemes that have now got an award, which is fantastic. Happy to have a further conversation about that. I better go to the other questions, Rachel. Should I just
So I'll
You're
pick up a couple and bring you back in. So yeah. There is a question in there around, is you the first port of call for Building with Nature to go to your regional wildlife trust? The first port of call is to go to the Building with Nature website, where there are a range of different assessors. So the wildlife trusts are endeavouring to step into this space, but there are various other ecological consultants and others who are also trained to apply the tool. So please have a look there, and also use the one-to-one form that Rachel just referenced, so that you can have a conversation with someone to find out who might be the best person to support you with your particular development. There was a question around what offers we might, is there a requirement for pilots, how housing associations might get involved, Gemma, and also there's a question there, Gemma, around local authorities and planning policies. So maybe if you could think about that, like public sector partners, in effect, I suppose is the question.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so just on the local authority connection, so absolutely, local authorities are using Building with Nature. So they're using the standards, and we have examples of where local authorities have referenced Building with Nature in their local plan policy. We've got a couple of plans going through examination at the moment, so it's really exciting to see how the inspector is responding to that. We also have examples where we are supporting local authorities to put the emphasis on high quality green infrastructure, and then reference out to Building with Nature as a preferred definition of that, but the focus being on making sure that applicants are responding to high quality green infrastructure within local plan policy. So we can give examples of both those, and please do get in touch with us about to find out more about those examples. But I would also encourage you to think about our green infrastructure training, because that's really where we can work with a really diverse set of stakeholders from local authorities, because it's not just planners who need to get on board with this. We encourage decision makers and also those other disciplinary specialists, highway engineers, SUDS engineers. Getting the right people in the room is really key to making good development management decisions and good policy making decisions. So that's what I wanted to say about local authorities. The other point, Rachel, was about pilots, I think. So
particularly housing associations and maybe public sector developers.
Yeah,
more than private.
Great question. Yeah, so we are working with a couple of social housing providers. Clarion Homes is one of our well, it was the first registered provider to get a Builder in Nature award for their scheme down in Plymouth, Barn Barton. You can see that case study on our website, and they've actually decided to make all of their schemes Builder in Nature, to use Builder in Nature in all of their schemes. So it's really important for us to work with registered providers and social housing providers, and just please get in touch with us. We're really more than happy to talk about any public infrastructure projects or any social housing projects. Yes, we've got small schemes as well. A small scheme in Cornwall at the moment is working with the standards. So I just want to give the message, it's not just large schemes. I know the projects we looked at today are relatively large in scale. We are working, you know, the standards can be used on schemes as small as 10 homes. So yeah, please do get in touch. Thanks, Rachel. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, there was another question around about the applicability to small schemes, so thank you for picking that up. And I think that it's their standards, aren't they? So they should be able to be thought through in whatever scale that you're working at. Definitely. There are a couple of questions around the relationship with the Environment Act and whether government recognise building with nature, or may either be making it mandatory or signposting. Probably unlikely that they'd make it mandatory because there are other standards are available, as you were thinking, but what's the indication that you've been getting for support from policymakers in government?
Yeah, I can give a view on that, Rachel. So we spend a good amount of time working closely with colleagues in government, and so I'll give a kind of snapshot of where we're at with England, Scotland and Wales. We do have a reference to Building with Nature in the National Design Guide, which MHCLG, Ministry of Housing, Community Local Government, published. It's back in 2019 now, but we're working closely with MHCLG and Natural England. They're developing some new guidance around green infrastructure to support the National Model Design Code approach to planning that we're seeing coming through the planning reform. So we're expecting reference there to Building with Nature, and more importantly to high quality green infrastructure, and then we can pick up on the ground and on a project basis how you then meet those new policy requirements. There's also some guidance coming out from Natural England about green infrastructure, and just to make clear in this forum that we're working very closely with Natural England, so we're not working in competition, and actually we're expecting them to highlight Building with Nature as a preferred accreditation system for their green infrastructure standards. So just to kind of upfront that. In Wales, we have a really good relationship with Welsh Government, who are also producing some fantastic green infrastructure guidance, and Building with Nature is a reference there. So developers in Wales can be using Building with Nature as a preferred mechanism to demonstrate compliance with green infrastructure. And then in Scotland too, just to be clear, the Biodiversity Net Gain approach is only in England. So Building with Nature is not wedded to that metric-led approach. And so in Scotland and in Wales, we're talking more about biodiversity resilience and making sure that we're talking about networks and the benefits. So that's that. You know, we're really excited that we have support from Scottish Government, Welsh Government. and English government, and that's probably all I need to say on that, Rachel, but I'm happy
Great.
for anyone to get in touch and ask more geeky questions, technical questions, or policy-based questions to us.
Yeah, so what I'll just pick up is that there are 2 more questions in the chat, which I don't think we'll have time for because we'll finish now. One was about future maintenance and some of the challenges of that. And the other one was around some of the delivery mechanisms that you might have around working with schemes like tiny forests, etc. But maybe they could be picked up in the follow-up information that's going to be sent after the event, because I'm sure most people would be interested in that. I'm aware we've come to the end of the event, so just wanted to emphasize, if you're curious about what we've been talking about today, please do get in touch through the one-to-one form so that we can think about your context and give you the support that you need to take any next steps. I'd like to thank our speakers today for sharing all of their experience and wisdom and knowledge, very much appreciated, and the Building with Nature team who've helped organise the event. And as participants, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you found it interesting and that we will be in touch again with you in future to talk more about it. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.